The ambulance dispatcher asked me for an emergency contact. I said my husband's name. And then I thought my parents should know too. That was my first mistake. I was 31 years old, a senior accountant at a mid-sized firm in Ottawa, and I had just been rear-ended on the Queensway during evening rush hour. The other driver ran a red light. My car was pushed into the concrete barrier. I remember the sound, not the crash itself, but the strange silence after, and the smell of something burning, and my hands shaking on the steering wheel even though I was trying very hard to hold them still. The paramedic who got me into the ambulance had kind eyes. She kept talking to me, asking me questions, telling me her name was Rebecca and that I was going to be okay. I had a suspected concussion, maybe a fractured wrist, the left one, the one I'd been bracing against the door panel. She told me I needed imaging, that the hospital would contact my emergency contact, my husband. I'll call him by his role because that's how I think of him in this story. The one person who actually showed up was in a client dinner in Gatineau. I knew he had his phone on silent. I told Rebecca his number anyway. Then I asked her if she could also call my parents. I gave her the number. I don't know why I did it. Habit maybe, or hope. Even then, after everything, still hope. She called. I heard her say the address, the Civic Campus emergency entrance. She said I'd been in an accident. She said I was stable, but they were running tests. I heard my mother's voice through the phone. Not the words, just the tone. And then Rebecca handed the phone back to me and said, quietly, she said they'll come when they can. When they can. I had glass in my hair. My left wrist was wrapped in a temporary splint. The fluorescent lights of the ER were doing something terrible to my eyes, and my parents said they'd come when they could. I found out later, much later, what they were doing at that moment. My younger sister had gotten a speeding ticket on the 417, $140. She'd called my parents crying, saying she didn't know how she was going to pay it, that she was already short on rent that month. My parents canceled the dinner they'd had with friends, went to my sister's apartment in Kanata, sat with her on the couch, and helped her figure out a plan. The ticket was $140. My sister has a full-time job. She was 26 years old. I want to be fair. I've tried, in the time since, to see my parents as people who love both their children, who maybe just made a bad call in a stressful moment, who didn't understand how serious it was. I've tried very hard to give them that. But when I think about lying in that hospital bed with a concussion and a cracked wrist, alone except for a nurse who wasn't mine, watching the ceiling tiles, I keep coming back to the same thing. They knew. Rebecca told them. And they chose my sister's speeding ticket anyway. My husband arrived at 7:43 in the evening. I know the time because I'd been watching the clock on the wall across from my bed and doing the math on how long it would take him to get from Gatineau, accounting for the bridge and the traffic. He came through the curtain still in his work shirt, no jacket, like he'd just left without stopping for anything. He sat down next to me and held my good hand and didn't say anything for a minute. Then he said, I got here as fast as I could. I said, I know. He said, where are your parents? I didn't answer right away. He looked at me and I think he understood something in my face because he didn't ask again. My parents arrived at 9:15. My mother walked in first, and her opening line, I have replayed it so many times I could say it in my sleep, was, you look fine. You don't look like someone who was in a terrible accident. My father nodded behind her, like this was a reasonable and comforting thing to say. I had a concussion diagnosis by then, confirmed. My left wrist had a hairline fracture. I had bruising across my chest and shoulder from the seatbelt, which the doctor said was actually a good sign, proof the seatbelt had done its job, but which hurt in a specific, deep way when I breathed too deeply. I had been given something for the headache that had started about an hour after impact, a headache that my husband later described as making me very gray around the eyes. You look fine, my mother said. I didn't say anything. My husband's jaw moved slightly, the way it does when he's deciding whether to speak. He decided not to. My father asked if the doctors had figured out who was at fault for the accident. I said yes, the other driver. There were witnesses and a traffic camera. He nodded and said, good, good. Make sure you get a lawyer. They stayed 40 minutes. My mother asked twice if I was sure I didn't need anything, in the tone of someone who was hoping the answer was no. My father read something on his phone. When they left, my mother kissed me on the forehead, carefully, like I might break, which felt ironic, and said, "Call us when they discharge you. Don't drive yourself home." As if that needed to be said. My husband and I didn't talk about it that night. He drove me home, got me settled, made me toast because I was supposed to eat something before the painkillers wore off, and we watched something on TV neither of us can remember. I fell asleep before 10. But the conversation was sitting there between us, patient, waiting. We had it a few days later, when I was more myself. He asked me what was going on with my family, not in an accusatory way, he's not that kind of person, but genuinely, like he was trying to understand something he'd been piecing together for a while. I told him, not just the accident, all of it. My parents had always favored my sister. I know that sounds like something every second sibling says, but I want to be specific because I think the specifics matter. When my sister wanted to go to Carleton for journalism, a school with higher tuition than the University of Ottawa, where I'd gone, my parents paid her full tuition and residence fees for 4 years. When I went to Ottawa for accounting, I got OSAP and a part-time job at a coffee shop on Bank Street. They said they didn't have the money when I was in school. They had it 4 years later when my sister enrolled. I never asked them to explain this. After university, I got my CPA, built my client base, started making decent money. My parents, around that same time, started having a rough go financially. My father had taken early retirement that turned out to be less comfortable than he planned. My mother worked part-time. They mentioned, casually at first and then more directly, that things were tight. I started helping. Not huge amounts at first. $200 here, $300 there when something came up. A car repair, a dental bill my mother's benefits didn't fully cover. It felt like the right thing to do. They were my parents. I had a steady income. It seemed straightforward, but it grew. By the time of the accident, I was transferring $800 a month to my parents. Every month, without fail. I'd set it up as an automatic transfer because early on they'd asked if I could make it regular so they could count on it. So I did. Regular. Like a subscription. Like a utility bill. I paid my parents $800 a month the way I paid my internet provider. My sister, in that same period, had taken a trip to Portugal with friends, bought a used car, and furnished a new apartment. I know because my mother sent me photos and told me how wonderful it all was. My husband listened to all of this without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How long has this been going on?" I said, 3 years. He did the math. I watched him do it. He didn't say the number out loud. Then he said very carefully, "What do you get out of it?" I didn't have an answer. Not a good one. I said something about it being family, about not wanting my parents to struggle, about hoping that eventually things would even out somehow. He nodded. He didn't push. But I could see him thinking, and I knew what he was thinking because I'd been thinking it too, in the back of my head, for a long time, behind all the automatic transfers. The accident cracked something open. Not dramatically. I didn't wake up the next morning with a plan. It was slower than that. I'd lie awake some nights with my wrist elevated on a pillow, and I'd think about my mother's voice through the phone. "They'll come when they can." And I'd feel something that I can only describe as a quiet settling. Like something in me had finally decided to stop waiting for a different answer. I called my parents the following Saturday morning. My mother answered. I told her I was doing okay, recovering well, that my wrist would need about 6 weeks. She said that was a relief. We talked for a few minutes. Weather, nothing. Then she mentioned, before I could bring it up myself, that my sister was having a hard month financially and that any extra help would make a real difference. I said, "Actually, I wanted to talk to you about the monthly transfers." There was a pause. I said, "I'm going to stop them." My mother said, "Stop them." Not a question, just the words, repeated in that particular tone that means she's recalibrating. I said yes. I said my husband and I had talked about it, that we were looking at buying a house, which was true. We'd been looking in the Stittsville area. and that we needed to redirect our finances. I didn't say anything about the accident. I didn't need to. The accident was just the moment I'd understood what I already knew. My mother said she understood. Her voice was very even, which was worse than if she'd been upset. My father, apparently listening nearby, said something in the background that she didn't repeat to me. I said goodbye. I went downstairs. My husband was making coffee, and I sat at the kitchen table and told him I'd done it. He set down his mug and came over and hugged me. Just that. My sister called that afternoon. She said, "I can't believe you're doing this to them right now." "They're stressed enough." I said, "They'll be okay." She said, "You always act like you're so much better than everyone else." I said, "That's not what this is." She said a few more things. I let her. When she was finished, I said I loved her, and I hoped things would ease up for her and that I had to go. I hung up. For about 6 weeks, I didn't hear much from my parents. The occasional text, my mother forwarding something, a recipe, an article, but nothing real, no phone calls. I noticed, but I didn't feel the silence. Then, in late October, I got a call from my firm's managing partner. She told me that I'd been selected for the firm's annual Excellence in Client Service Recognition, a small ceremony they hold every fall, dinner at a nice restaurant downtown, the partners, some senior staff, a few invited clients. She said she was delighted to tell me herself. I thanked her and hung up and sat with it for a minute because I don't take compliments from my profession easily. I've worked hard for 12 years. That recognition meant something to me. I told my husband that night. He was genuinely thrilled. He said we had to celebrate, that we'd go for dinner wherever I wanted. I said I wanted ramen from that place on Preston Street and to watch something stupid on TV, and he said perfect. I almost didn't invite my parents. I went back and forth about it for a week. My husband left it entirely up to me. Whatever you want, I'll support it, which is one of the reasons I married him. Eventually, I decided to invite them. It was a professional recognition. It was important to me, and somewhere, still, I wanted them to see that. The ceremony was on the Thursday evening in early November at a restaurant near Sparks Street. I wore a dark green dress I'd had for 2 years and finally had an occasion for. My husband wore his good suit. We arrived a few minutes early. My parents arrived 12 minutes late. My mother came in looking slightly flustered, and her first comment, before hello, before congratulations, was that the parking downtown had cost them $18. $18. I smiled. I said, "There's a table over here." The dinner was lovely. My managing partner gave a short speech, warm and specific, about the value I'd brought to certain long-term client relationships. She said my name in a sentence with the word exceptional. One of the clients I'd worked with for 4 years stood up briefly and said something about trust, about what it means to have an accountant who actually understands your business. I felt, sitting there, like someone who had earned something. Afterward, during dessert, the table was loose and warm, the way it gets after a good meal and a couple of glasses of wine. Someone asked me how long I'd been at the firm. I said 12 years, since I was 19 and working part-time in the filing room while I finished my degree. A couple of people laughed. Someone said I'd practically grown up there. My mother, who had been mostly quiet during dinner, said to the woman beside her, not to me, to the woman beside her, "She's always been the steady one. Her sister is more the creative type." The woman nodded politely. I looked at my husband. He looked at me. I set down my fork. I don't know exactly what made me do what I did next. Maybe it was the $18 parking comment at the door. Maybe it was the timing, my managing partner's words still hanging in the air, that word exceptional, and then my mother redirecting the conversation to my sister within 20 minutes. Maybe it was 3 years of automatic bank transfers and a speeding ticket and an ER room with fluorescent lights and a splint on my wrist. I said, to the table, in a voice that was very calm, "My parents taught me a lot about steadiness. They've needed a lot of steady support over the years, financially. I've been sending them $800 a month for the past 3 years. That comes out to about $28,800. Around the same amount I would have needed to put a down payment on a house last spring, which we ended up delaying because of cash flow." The table went quiet. I smiled. I picked up my water glass. I said, "Anyway, I'm glad I could be here tonight. This recognition really means a lot. My mother's face had gone a color I don't have a word for. My father was looking at the tablecloth. My managing partner, bless her, made a small sound and smoothly pivoted to asking one of the clients about their renovation plans. And the conversation moved on, the way conversations do when someone socially skilled decides to rescue a room. My parents left shortly after. My mother didn't say goodbye to me directly. She said something to my husband about getting their coats. My father shook my hand. Shook my hand like we'd just concluded a business meeting. I squeezed it and let go. My husband and I walked out into the cold November air, and he put his arm around me, and we didn't say anything for half a block. Then he said, "You okay?" I thought about it for a second. I said, "Yeah, actually, yes." My sister called me the next morning absolutely furious. She said I had humiliated the family. She said I had aired private information in front of my boss and clients. She said I was vindictive and selfish and that I had clearly never cared about any of them. I let her finish. Then I said, I told the truth. To people who think highly of me. That's all. She hung up. My parents didn't call for 2 weeks. When my mother finally reached out, it was a text. Hope you're well. Dad's back is bothering him again. I replied, sorry to hear that. Hope he feels better. That was it. That's where we are. My husband and I are buying a house. We found a place in Stittsville, 3 bedrooms, a yard, close enough to the school zone that eventually, someday, it'll matter. We got our mortgage pre-approval in December. The numbers worked out fine. The $800 a month redirected made more difference than I'd let myself calculate while I was still sending it. My wrist healed completely by January. I'm back to carrying groceries, typing without pain, doing everything I used to do. The physiotherapist said I had good bone density for my age, which I chose to take as a compliment. I think about that night in the ER sometimes. The ceiling tiles, the clock on the wall, Rebecca, the paramedic who talked to me the whole way and had kind eyes, the 40 minutes my parents stayed before they left. The fact that even then, even knowing everything I knew by then, I had still called them. I don't regret calling them. It's important that I understand why I did it, and I think I do now. I called because I was scared and hurt, and I wanted my parents. That's not weakness. That's just what that is. What I don't do anymore is wait for them to show up differently. That part is done. Last week, my daughter, she's 4, and she says things that stop me completely, asked me why I was looking at my phone funny after I'd gotten a message from my mother. I told her I was just thinking. She climbed up next to me on the couch and said in her completely serious 4-year-old way, "You think too much, Mama." I laughed until my eyes watered. She patted my arm, very solemn, and went back to her coloring book. I put my phone down. I left the message unread. And I sat there in the afternoon light with my daughter and the house we're going to buy, and the husband who showed up in his work shirt with no jacket because he didn't stop for anything. And I thought, okay, this is the life. This is the actual one. I used to think that loyalty was something you inherited. That because my parents raised me, fed me, drove me to hockey practice and signed my permission slips, there was an account somewhere with my name on it, and when things got hard, I could draw from it. I believed that for a long time. I kept believing it even when the evidence was pointing somewhere else entirely. What I understand now is that loyalty isn't inherited. It's demonstrated over and over in small moments and large ones, and the record of it is written in what people actually do, not what they mean to do, not what they'd probably do if the timing were better, but what they do right now when it costs them something. My parents' record, it turns out, was different from the one I'd been reading. I don't say that with anger anymore. The anger burned off a while ago, somewhere between the ER ceiling tiles and the morning I made that phone call and canceled the transfers. What's left is something quieter, a kind of clear-eyed recognition that I think, if I'm honest, took far too long to arrive. What took me so long was a failure of honesty. With myself mainly. I kept looking at what my parents said rather than what they did. I kept extending credit they hadn't earned. There's a word for that kind of thinking, and it isn't loyalty, it's avoidance. I was avoiding the truth because the truth required me to change something, and change is uncomfortable even when it's necessary. especially when it's necessary. The smarter thing, the thing I'd tell anyone else in that situation, is to pay attention early, to look at the pattern, not the exceptions. My parents had been showing me who they prioritized for years: the tuition, the trips, the monthly calls that always, eventually, circle back to what my sister needed. I saw it. I filed it away somewhere I didn't have to look at directly. That wasn't wisdom. That was me choosing comfort over clarity. And the $800 a month, I have to be honest about that too. I told myself it was generosity, but generosity freely given doesn't accumulate resentment the way mine did. What I was really doing was buying a version of my family that didn't exist, trying to purchase the warmth and the showing up and the phone calls that weren't about money. You can't buy that. I know that now. You can only stop spending on things that aren't for sale. What I'm more proud of, looking back, is that I eventually stopped. That took something. Not bravado, not a dramatic decision. Just a quiet decision made on a Tuesday morning when I was finally tired enough to be honest. Tired in the good way. The way that comes right before something changes. My daughter patted my arm and told me I think too much. She's 4. She's right. There's a kind of thinking that clarifies and a kind that just circles. I spent years in the second kind. I'm trying to spend more time in the first. The house is real. The mortgage is manageable. My wrist healed clean. My husband showed up in his work shirt with no jacket, and he's still here. And that's the life, the actual one, the one made of what people do when it's inconvenient. I think that's worth more than I used to let myself believe.